Good day. In the aftermath of Victoria Nuland's resignation, and of course not directly connected to it, though, as some wise man once said, everything is connected, and certainly in politics it is, or certainly in geopolitics it is. Anyway, in the aftermath of Victoria Nuland's resignation, we've now had two very disturbing addresses by two important Western leaders. One is President Biden, who has just delivered his State of the Union address, and the other is President Macron of France, who has spoken to a private gathering of the faction leaders of the parliamentary factions in the French Parliament. Both speeches, if I can call them that, were controversial, to say the least, and I'm going to return to them later in this program. But before I do, I think I will follow my traditional course, which is provide a brief rundown of the situation on the front lines in the Ukraine conflict, which is the conflict which is the catalyst behind all of these events, and which perhaps provides the explanation for the edgy atmosphere we're seeing start to develop both in the United States and in Europe. Now, the first thing to say is that over the last 24 hours, we have received, as we sometimes do, less information from the battlefronts. That is not a reason, however, to think that the situation on the battlefronts is slackening. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with its weekly update of the situation over the previous week in Ukraine, and the week before, Ukrainian combat losses, dead and wounded, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, was 7,395. The week that has just passed, they were at the same general level, 7,285. Ukrainian losses, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, continue to be astonishingly heavy. I think at the heaviest level since the early weeks of the war. And the Russian Defense Ministry update provides us with some idea of where the heaviest fighting is going on. Firstly, it does seem as if there has been a renewal of the fighting in the Kupiansk-Liman direction. We've not been getting a huge amount of information about what's been going on there, but the Russian Defense Ministry talks about the Russian troops having improved their positions along the front lines, and that they've eliminated Ukrainian troops in various places and have repelled counterattacks, and the two towns or villages that they specifically refer to are Sinkovka, which is close to Kupiansk, and Terny, which is on the Zherebets River, somewhere to the south. Now, there have been reports over the last 2 weeks or so about Russian attacks on Terny, and claims that the Russians have captured another village called Makeyevka on the Zherebets River. The Russian Defense Ministry has not confirmed those claims about the capture of either Terny or Makeyevka. I understand that there is actually fighting going on in Terny itself, and certainly it looks as if there's been a significant uptick in the casualties in this part of the battlefronts. There's also some reason to believe that the Russians have advanced or achieved more advances in the Sinkovka area, but again, it's difficult to get a precise sense of what is happening. What I will say is this. The Ukrainian authorities seem to be extremely worried about the general situation in Kharkiv region. They have apparently announced the evacuation of the population from a large number of villages in Kharkiv region, which strongly suggests that they expect that there's going to be heavy fighting in those villages before very long. There were muddled reports. I'm going to discuss this in more detail later in this program about the Ukrainians creating fortified positions in Kharkiv city itself. Clearly, fighting is going on. The level of fighting has increased. The Russians have told us that the Ukrainians have lost 540 men, dead and wounded, in the Kupiansk-Liman area over the last week, which is more than we've seen in earlier weeks, in more recent weeks. But one senses still that this is the quiet before the storm. One hears reports of huge Russian forces gathering on the northern border of Kharkiv region within Russia itself, in the area of Belgorod, which the Ukrainians, by the way, still sporadically shell. And of course, the Russians are strongly positioned around Kupiansk and close to the Zherebets river in the south. And it could be that before long, this is where the next blow from the Russians will fall. But other than that, we can see that the major fighting over the last week continued to be in three places. Firstly, Bakhmut, the area around Bakhmut, and the Russian Defense Ministry refers to fighting near Klishevka, Kurdyumovka, Andreevka, and Krasnoye. Krasnoye is, of course, Ivanivska, at least the name for this village is Ivanivska. The Russians refer to it as Krasnoye. There are multiple reports that the Russians now control most of this village. They're also heavily bombing Ukrainian positions in the fields to the west of Ivanivska, and they are pounding Chasiv Yar, the town which all the indications are that they eventually intend to storm. And the bombing of Chasiv Yar has been relentless, and it continues to be ongoing. And there are reports that Chasiv Yar is being, in effect, leveled, that it is essentially being destroyed in anticipation of the Russian advance upon it that will follow the fall, the imminent fall of Ivanivska. Now, there's been speculation about what the Russians might be planning to do once Ivanivska falls, once they reach the Chasiv Yar Canal, which they will certainly be able to do once Ivanivska falls. There's been some suggestions that they would be more likely to advance northward along the canal towards Siversk. My own personal view is that if they're bombing Chasiv Yar as intensively as they have been doing, that clearly indicates that their objective is to capture Chasiv Yar itself, in which case another important town in this chessboard of towns, large, small towns and villages that makes up Donbass will fall. And of course, Chasiv Yar apparently is on higher ground, and other places like Konstantinovka to the west are on lower ground. And it could be in that case that the Russian offensive westwards towards Kramatorsk and beyond Kramatorsk to the Dnieper River will at this point start to gain faster momentum. Anyway, very heavy fighting in this area, and we learn that in this area specifically, over the last week, the Ukrainians lost 1,970 men, dead and wounded, almost 2,000, in other words. along with 11 tanks, 17 armoured vehicles, and 25 field artillery guns. So, Ukrainian losses in this area very high, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. Of course, they don't provide us with details of their own losses. I will come to that shortly. But the biggest, most intense fighting of all is in the area of Avdiivka. And here, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, the Ukrainians lost 2,860 men dead and wounded over the last week, including 7 tanks, of which 2 were Abrams tanks, 34 armoured fighting vehicles, 20 field artillery pieces, and 1 HIMARS multiple launch rocket system. And in fact, we've seen film of the destruction of that HIMARS vehicle. So, huge number of Ukrainian losses in the Avdiivka sector over the course of the last week. As I've discussed, it seems that at the back end of the week before, the Russians stormed Orlovka, Berdychi, and Toninka, these 3 villages that make up the current Ukrainian defense line. Syrsky, the newly appointed commander of the Ukrainian military, then launched a counterattack, putting together what reserves he had and committing some of Ukraine's best units to it. They were able to knock the Russians back in all 3 of these villages and take control over them. But the fighting has been intense, and the Ukrainian losses have been extremely heavy. Now, the latest reports that I've seen continue to say that the Russians are now well on the way to recapturing or finally consolidating control of Orlovka. And Orlovka, as I've discussed before, is the village in the middle. Tonenka is to the south, Berdychi is to the north. If the Russians are able to consolidate control of Orlovka and of the fields around Orlovka, and there's some suggestions that they are, in fact, gradually gaining control of the fields, then Tonenka becomes undefendable, and before long, Berdychi does also. And at that point, this hurriedly improvised Ukrainian defense line, which Ukraine is defending at such enormous cost that this defense line will then start to collapse. One point I would make, which is interesting, is that Ukraine lost more tanks, according to the Russians, in the Bakhmut area over the last week than in the Avdiivka area. 11 tanks in the Bakhmut area, 7 tanks in the Avdiivka area, which suggests, to me at least, that Ukraine tried more counterattacks actually in the Bakhmut area over the course of last week than they did in the Avdiivka area. Most of the fighting in the Avdiivka area is becoming a slug match for these 3 villages, with the Ukrainians, of course, massively outgunned by the Russians, outbombed by the Russians. The Russian Air Force is, as I've said in many programs, now very active, and all the indications being that it is the Ukrainians, not the Russians, who are suffering the big losses in this area. And then lastly, we have more reports from the Russians about fighting going on in the South Donetsk direction. This is a huge area that appears to include places like Vuhledar and Staromayorsk and others. And here we're told that the Ukrainians lost 1,620 men killed and wounded and also that they lost 6 tanks. Now, elsewhere in the fighting, it's been on a much smaller scale. So, for example, in Zaporozhye region, Zaporozhye and Kherson region, where there's been much talk about some big Russian offensive around Rabotino. According to the Russians, Ukrainian losses here were 295 soldiers killed or wounded. So this is also where 2 HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems were destroyed, both on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. There's a lot of reporting and discussion about what's going on in Rabotino, Verbovoye, and those sort of places. But in fact, the actual situation points to the main fighting continuing to happen in central Donbass, around Marinka, around Avdiivka, and around Bakhmut. There may be a big offensive coming in the north, in Kharkiv region, but for the moment at least, Zaporozhye, Kherson, the areas where Ukraine launched its offensive last summer, that area looks like a sideshow compared to the major fighting that's taking place elsewhere. Now, I've discussed some of the situation in Avdiivka, the fact that the Russians seem to be focusing on capturing Orlovka, and, by the way, also inflicting very, very heavy losses on the Ukrainian forces. Perhaps the most dramatic news, however, continues to come further south from Avdiivka in the Marinka area. There are now lots of reports that the Russians are gaining more ground within Krasnogorovka. Krasnogorovka, small town near to Donetsk city, population before the war around 14,000, so smaller than Avdiivka, whose population before the war was around 30,000, but slightly bigger than Marinka, which had a population of about 10,000 before the war. This is just to give a sense of the scale of these places that are being fought over. Krasnogorovka, like Avdiivka and Marinka, heavily fortified by Ukraine. One of the major towns, one of the major points, rather, locations from which Ukraine has shelled Donetsk city. There has, by the way, been a significant dropping off of shelling of Donetsk city since Avdiivka fell and since the Russians were able to capture the villages to the west of Avdiivka. So the fall of Avdiivka has already had a certain effect. If Krasnogorovka is captured, Ukraine will have lost all the major fortified positions it created close to Donetsk city, and which it used to conduct what was in effect its 8-year siege of Donetsk city. Pesky fell in August 2022. Marinka fell in December 2023. Avdiivka fell in February 2024. And it looks like Krasnogorovka will fall at some point over the next few weeks or months. The Russians have been bombing Krasnogorovka relentlessly, and it seems that they are gradually advancing, and they're also in the process of storming these villages to the north of Krasnogorovka, and in particular the small town of Pervomayorsk, which they are apparently, they've by now captured the greater part of it. So a big battle taking place there, and again, most of the reports suggest that the Russians are within a few days now of completing the capture of Novomikhailovka, to the south of Marinka, which is this big village, about 1,400 people before the war, which would enable the Russians, once they've captured this village, to start progressively cutting the supply lines to Vuhledar, the major fortified Ukrainian town in the south of Donbass, controlling the positions, Ukrainian positions of Donbass in the south. Now, I would quickly add that there has been one slightly strange fact about this Russian Defense Ministry update, which is that some of the places where the heaviest fighting is taking place, Krasnogorovka, for example, and Novomikhailivka, well, I can't find any reference in this Russian Defense Ministry update to them. And of course, this is becoming the pattern now. When fighting is taking place intensively within a particular location, with the Russians perhaps expecting to capture it reasonably soon, the pattern from the Russians is to say less about what's going on in that particular location. And in fact, sometimes it drops entirely out of the Defense Ministry updates. And that seems to be the case with these two places, Krasnogorovka and Novomikhailivka at the moment. Anyway, that is the situation on the front lines. The Russians continuing to exert enormous pressure on Ukraine, and we now have report after report, article after article appearing in the Western media, all of them telling us that the situation for Ukraine is becoming critical and that Ukraine is running short of men and equipment and machines. And I think there's an article somewhere that says that they're starting to run short of tanks as well. So not just ammunition, not just air defense missiles. Apparently the situation with air defense missiles is becoming critical, but also apparently tanks also, which may explain why the Ukrainians have been obliged to deploy more of their tanks, their Abrams tanks, their precious Abrams tanks, to places like Berdichi, where we have confirmation that at least 3 of these tanks have been destroyed. So, a grim picture, and one becoming grimmer by the hour, and one which, as I said, explains the edgy mood in Europe and on the part of some people also, as we will come to shortly, in the United States. But before I turn to those topics, just a few more things to say. Firstly, there's been confirmation that General Zaluzhny, the former military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, sacked by President Zelensky following a complex and difficult power struggle. Anyway, despite his constant refusals to apparently accept his sacking, once he was sacked, he did what he had previously told Zelensky that he wouldn't do, which is that he's agreed to be appointed Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom. So he's coming to London, where he will presumably be replacing his former boss, Alexei Reznikov, the former Ukrainian defense minister, who was the previous ambassador. I wonder what he's becoming of Reznikov, where he's going to. But anyway, Zaluzhny is coming to London, which from Zelensky's point of view removes Zaluzhny from the scene. Zaluzhny had become a major focus of loyalty within the Ukrainian army. His popularity was overtaking Zelensky's own in Ukraine, in fact, left it far behind. The dismissal was very unpopular with the wider Ukrainian public. Much of the West was not happy about it either. There was a general groan when General Syrski was appointed to take over Zaluzhny's place. But despite many expectations, and I suspect some hopes, that Zaluzhny would lead some kind of opposition to Zelensky, he's decided instead to do that which he had previously refused to do, which is take the job of ambassador to Britain. Now, why has Zaluzhny done that? Well, it could be because he's come to the conclusion that Zelensky's position is too secure and that there is no real point in challenging Zelensky. Or it could be that General Zaluzhny doesn't want to become a focus of opposition to Zelensky at a time when he feels that national unity within Ukraine is imperative, given that Ukraine is at war. I have to say, I don't believe either of these explanations. The second one is particularly improbable, given that Zaluzhny, as we saw, was perfectly ready to cause divisions and ruptures within Ukraine, whilst he was military commander. He spent his time leaking unflattering comments about Zelensky to the Telegram channels, Ukrainian Telegram channels, and he outright refused Zelensky's repeated requests to stand down from his job. Those are not the actions of somebody who places the cause of national unity as the very highest priority. As for Zelensky's position being beyond challenge, I saw the other day a commentary by David Arachamia, the head of Zelensky's party in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. And Arachamia was saying that the Rada, the parliament, is today almost deserted. Nobody really wants to be there most of the time. And that the demoralization is so extreme that essentially enthusiasm for participating in the electoral process has gone. That doesn't suggest an enthusiastic core of people willing to stand by Zelensky in this time of crisis. My own view, of course, I haven't spoken to Zaluzhny, so I don't know this for a fact, but my own view is that Zaluzhny has decided to go to London because he wants to be out of the scene, out of the place, out of Ukraine, because he senses that at some point over the next few months, everything is going to start to fall apart, and he doesn't want to be a part of that. He wants to be safe and away from London before that happens and before anybody is quick enough to pin at least part of the blame on him. So that's Zaluzhny. As for Zelensky, well, apparently he's soon again going to be on his travels. He spends much of his time now, as much of his time as he can, not just outside Kiev, but outside Ukraine as well. His latest destination apparently is Turkey. He's apparently hoping, who knows what he's hoping to achieve in Turkey. Maybe he's hoping to get the Turks to supply him with 155mm shells or other military equipment. Who knows? Erdogan has shown a certain willingness to do things like that in the past, partly, I suspect, to needle the Russians. But Erdogan obviously can see the way the wind is blowing. He's had a very friendly conversation with Putin recently. He's apparently keen to get cooperation from the Russians to build another nuclear power station in Turkey. There's apparently discussions about between the Russians and the Turks about that. I've just been reading about it in Interfax, the Interfax news agency. So most likely Zelensky will go to Turkey looking for, well, whatever he can find there, hoping to get more support from Erdogan. But ultimately, like all of his recent visits, the main purpose is to get Zelensky out of Ukraine and out of Kiev. Just saying. So, that's the movements of Zelensky and Zaluzhny. Now, I have to say that there have been two governmental decisions, important governmental decisions made in Ukraine recently. One is that the Ukrainians apparently still unable to agree on a mobilization law. That law still stuck in the Ukrainian parliament, but perhaps paradoxically, even though they can't agree to mobilize more people, at a time when the Ukrainian army is agreed to be suffering from severe shortages of manpower, and at a time when General Syrski is supposed to have come up with an audit which found that nobody can locate 700,000 men who are supposed to be in the Ukrainian military. There's no idea of where they are, what's become of them. At a time like this, when the situation on the front lines is cracking, the one thing Ukraine has managed to do, and which Zelensky has signed off on, is pass not a mobilization law, but a demobilization law. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about this seemingly paradoxical decision. Some are suggesting that this is a way for Ukraine to conceal the scale of its losses, pretend that men who have died or been critically wounded have instead just been demobilized, and that's why they're not appearing on the rolls of the regiments. It's probably some part of that. But I suspect also that it's partly another attempt by Zelensky to shore up domestic support in Ukraine. He senses that the mood in the country is becoming more bitter and more angry and more demoralized. And so he passes a law, or he gets a law passed for some sort of demobilization, and that he hopes will lighten the mood at what might be a sensitive time for him, because his constitutional term as president is about to end, and he prefers, I think, to want people feeling a little more optimistic about the situation than they currently are. I have to say, I am deeply skeptical that this demobilization law is indeed going to release large numbers of men from the army. Were it to do so, even if a mobilization law were passed, and even if that mobilization law were successful, it would simply mean that veteran soldiers would be replaced by green, untrained soldiers. And I can't imagine that in the present situation, that is what Ukraine realistically intends to do. So that's one thing. The other thing that's coming out of Ukraine is a lot of information about the building of the fortified lines. And as I think I discussed in a program 2 days ago, I've had a very interesting explanation of why it would be impossible for Ukraine to build fortified lines on anything like the kind of scale that the Russians did. Ukraine simply doesn't have the resources, the raw materials, the manpower, the digging equipment to build something analogous to the Russian Surovikin line. And, well, that does, in fact, generally seem to be the case. The New York Times has apparently spoken about Ukrainian fortifications as being sparse, rudimentary trench lines, which lack many of the additional fortifications that could help slow Russian tanks and help defend major roads and important terrain. I haven't read the article, the full article from which I've quoted, but I understand that that specifically refers to fortifications in the Avdiivka sector. But I understand from other sources that it is likely to be true right across Ukraine as well. And we've now had a discussion about this from a retired colonel of the Russian military, Anatoly Matviichuk. Now, Matviichuk, he's a Russian officer and very obviously loyal to Russia. But Matviichuk is a Ukrainian name. So he's obviously of Ukrainian provenance. And perhaps that means that he's more familiar with Ukrainian matters, Ukrainian publications than other Russian officers might be. Just saying. But anyway, Matviichuk has gone on to say that they dig in the ground, try to create some obstacle zones that are simply not effective and do not match the criteria of modern warfare. They failed in both the quality and quantity of such fortifications that they build along their fortified lines. We, Russia, could lay between 500 to 1,000 mines per 1 kilometer of front line. We established lines of dragon's teeth with gaps no more than 1.5 meters wide, which would not allow modern tanks to pass without special engineering assistance. Today, Ukraine cannot do that. And Matviichuk, this is taking this from an interview he's given to the Russian media, he says that Ukraine simply doesn't have the military, with its military-industrial complex intact, as it simply lacks the capability to produce the components needed for the construction of fortifications. And I've heard more reports about this. Dima, the Military Summary Channel, discussed this briefly in one of his recent updates. He said that according to one commentator, I haven't seen this report from this particular commentator, it would take, at the current pace of construction, something like 6 years for Ukraine to be able to build something analogous to the Surovikin line, which Russia built in about 6 months. Well, I think this is probably true. I would say that, in my opinion, I've said this before, had Ukraine concentrated on building strong defense lines in the winter of 2022-2023, instead of deciding to launch its disastrous summer offensive, then perhaps something could have been achieved. But today, with all the problems that exist, with the shortage of resources, with the relentless missile and drone attacks that the Russians are conducting, and by the way, there were huge Russian drone attacks right across Ukraine yesterday. Well, with all of that going on, it's simply illogical to think that Ukraine can reproduce these sort of defense lines now. So that's where I'm going to finish discussing what's going on in Ukraine itself today. There's been, as is often the way, a certain reduction of information from the battlefronts. That doesn't, by the way, necessarily mean, as I've come to realize, an operational pause. It merely means a pause in reporting. But overall, the situation remains the same. Ukraine's army continues to be ground down. It's running short of men, machines, and ammunition. The Russians are becoming stronger. There are rumors of a big offensive being prepared, perhaps for the late spring, in Kharkiv region. And given how fragile the Ukrainian army now is, I have to say that if the Russians do launch a big offensive with, say, 100,000 men, opening a new front line in northern Kharkiv region, I think that Ukraine would simply not be in a position to withstand it. This is how it seems to me. Anyway, difficult situation for Ukraine overall, and as a result, growing alarm and concern in the West. Now, before I carry on and come to the West, I just wanted to say, and this might also be a reflection of the edgy atmosphere in the West, late yesterday and early this morning, the British and American embassies in Moscow gave out a warning that a major terrorist incident in Moscow was anticipated for today. As of the time of making this program, there is no news of such an incident actually taking place. If they do have actual information about a terrorist incident of that kind, one would hope and assume that they're sharing it with the Russian authorities. Just saying. It would be completely irresponsible if they did not, and might even suggest a degree of complicity. Just saying again. Or it could just be intended to rattle nerves in Ukraine, in Moscow, at a time when nerves in Western capitals are becoming themselves increasingly rattled. And that brings me now to these two speeches. I'm going to deal with President Biden's briefly, because it seemed to me, some people are saying that it was a campaign speech, an electoral campaign speech, masquerading as a State of the Union address. I suppose in a way that is true, but I have to also say that it was the most angry, argumentative, divisive State of the Union address I have ever heard. And I would also say that the president, when he made the speech, referenced two earlier presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. In the case of Abraham Lincoln, as a student, I read every one of President Lincoln's speeches, which he gave during the American Civil War. They did not, by the way, include State of the Union speeches. In those days, the president didn't give a State of the Union address. He sent a written report to Congress, just saying. But I read every single speech that Lincoln gave during the period when he was President of the United States, as well as some of the speeches that he made previously. And I haven't read every speech and comment and interview that President Roosevelt gave during the time when he was president. But I've read all the most important ones, and I remember most of the most important ones. And it's important to say that Lincoln and Roosevelt both were presidents during periods of extreme crisis. Lincoln during a civil war, in fact, a tremendous civil war, an event, a cataclysmic event, which transformed America. And President Roosevelt was, of course, the president of the United States, leading the United States during the Great Depression and the Second World War. And neither president spoke in the way that President Biden did during his State of the Union address. Neither of these presidents was as abusive and as trenchant and as critical of their opponents as President Biden was yesterday. President Lincoln always conveyed a sense of humanity and compassion with great dignity in all of his speeches, and always sought to be inclusive and to unite the nation. In fact, he spoke, as I'd said previously, at his last inaugural address, almost essentially the last speech he gave. He ended it with the words, with charity for all, with malice towards none, with charity for all. We saw very little of that, none of that yesterday from President Biden. And Roosevelt always, for his part, conveyed a mood of cheerful optimism and humanity and charm, which caused people to refer to him as the happy warrior. The contrast with this speech we heard yesterday was astonishing. And the other thing that struck me about the speech, and I'm not going to get into the details of what he said about his domestic programs, which, apart from the fact that he's going to increase taxes and seek to reverse a major Supreme Court decision, which, well, everyone knows what I'm referring to. Well, all of that seemed to me pretty thin when you come down to it. But about foreign policy, he had astonishingly little to say. He started with intemperate and angry references to Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine, criticizing again President Putin specifically. But it was interesting to see how quickly he moved off that topic and how little he had to say about it, and the way in which his primary purpose in bringing that topic up was in order to use it, in order to criticize his domestic opponents, who he was trying to somehow imply were doing the work of President Putin's for him. So little said there ultimately about Ukraine, not much about China, a somewhat far-fetched and strange plan to establish a port in Gaza. One would have thought again that a ceasefire of some kind might have been a more practical way of dealing with the acknowledged problems in Gaza. But overall, very little on foreign policy. And I don't find this surprising at all, because one of the major reasons why the president is in the position that he is in is because he and his administration miscalculated badly about the war. I obviously was not a party to the discussions that took place in the United States, in the White House, in the Executive Office, in the State Department, the National Security Council, in the run-up to the start of the conflict in Ukraine in February 2022. But I am sure that none of the people involved in those discussions expected that 2 years later, the president would find himself faced in Ukraine with the situation that exists now. There would have been, I am sure, confident expectations that the massive wave of sanctions that the United States and the Western powers were preparing to launch against Russia would massively destabilize the Russian economy and would destabilize the political situation in Russia, forcing President Putin's resignation and the fall of his government. And of course, this time last year, even as those expectations of a victory in the economic war were not fulfilled, well, there was widespread hope, as we all remember, that the Ukrainian offensive for the summer of 2023, that would deal the knockout blow, and it would defeat the Russian army and break through to the Black Sea and to the Sea of Azov and isolate Crimea and achieve victory that way. Neither of those things has happened. The economic war, to all intents and purposes, has been lost. It was fascinating to see how the president, again, was trying to blame the higher inflation, which is to some extent a product of that economic war, upon everyone except himself. But anyway, that's again an aside. So the economic war has been lost, and the military war is being lost. And that means that the president, who probably expected that by this point in his presidency, he would be positioned ahead of the presidential election as a victorious president who had achieved the biggest foreign policy success of any US president since the end of the Cold War. The president is on the defensive, is instead on the defensive. His domestic achievements, though talked up by many, are disputed. The success of his economic policies is disputed by many, including myself. And his foreign policy lies in ruins. Instead of victory in Ukraine, he has a war in Ukraine on his hands, which his proxies in Ukraine are losing, and he's stuck in a conflict in the Middle East in which his fatuous proposals to establish a port in Gaza, well, what that tells us is that he has no real plan or idea of what to do, and nor do his advisors. So, in this kind of situation, he retreats into aggressiveness and anger and tries to talk up divisions and the threat to democracy from within, and that explains, to my mind, the astonishing speech that we got yesterday. I would add that it is perhaps not surprising that the person who is ultimately responsible for this debacle and for the president finding himself in this particular situation in which he is in at the moment, that is to say Victoria Nuland, has now departed the scene. I have been thinking deeply about her resignation over the last couple of days. I've noticed one other thing about the statement that Secretary Blinken published on the occasion of her resignation. And of Of course, it says, it does, or rather it fails to wish Victoria Nuland well in her retirement. I don't know whether that is commonly done in the United States, but I would have thought that it was. I suspect that there's been a growing feeling, not just within the permanent US state, the Pentagon and the officials at the State Department, that Victoria Nuland and her Russia and Ukraine obsession have led the United States into a very difficult place, and that what the United States now needs to do is to try to find some way of extricating itself from it. And so I think that those people think that, but I suspect also some people in the Democratic Party are probably also now tired of Victoria Nuland and her Ukraine obsession, and have concluded that the way she has conducted Project Ukraine over the last 2 years has been, to put it mildly, unhelpful. Thus, the fact that she was passed over for promotion to the post of Deputy Secretary of State, and the further pressures that probably were brought to bear and which appear to have resulted in her resignation. So, an angry speech from a president who perhaps doesn't have exactly his back to the wall, but who feels that things are not going as he expected that they would by this point in his presidency. But alarming though President Biden's speech was, at least to me, it is eclipsed by far with this astonishing speech that President Macron made to the faction leaders of the French Parliament. And, well, there are multiple accounts of it now appearing in the French media, and they are collectively appalling. Anyway, what seems to have happened is that Macron, having spent a lot of time trying to persuade other European leaders upon the need to send European troops to Ukraine, having gained some support from President Pavel of the Czech Republic, who I suspect is starting to feel some political pressure. Based on my admittedly brief time that I've spent in the Czech Republic, I can't imagine that most people there are at all keen in seeing the Czech Republic drawn into a war with Russia. There is strong antagonism to Russia on the part of some people in Prague, but I didn't get the impression that that was the general feeling across the country. And even in Prague, I doubt that many people there would welcome a conflict between the Czech Republic and Russia. But anyway, President Pavel, maybe not feeling wholly secure, is trying to overcompensate, as people sometimes do, by appearing to give some support to President Macron. But anyway, Macron himself, trying to talk up this idea of sending European troops to Ukraine, he had this meeting with the faction leaders of the parliament to try to persuade them as well. And according to the French media, they were collectively horrified by what they heard him say. Apparently, he was showing them all kinds of maps. He was talking about the threats from the Russians to take Kiev and Odessa. He was saying again that a victory for Russia would be unacceptable, that it would put the whole security of Europe in jeopardy. He said that there must be no limits at all to the kind of support that France and Europe should give to Ukraine, and given that France, of course, is itself a nuclear power, if you do away with limits, then you are possibly opening, at least in theory, up the possibility of nuclear weapons being used. And he said that there must be no acceptance of any Russian red lines. And the faction leaders, apparently without exception, told him that this was dangerous, reckless talk. The parliamentary leader of Le Pen's party, apparently begged him not to lead France into a war with Russia. The French, the left-wing parties, Mélenchon's group and the Communist Party also said the same. The Republicans were also horrified by these proposals. This is the centre-right party, and it's important to say that without their support, the French government, the Macron's party itself, would lose its ability to get legislation passed through the parliament. And anyway, the faction leaders told him, stop, don't do what you're doing. But President Macron decided nonetheless that he would press on. And as I understand it, pretty much the entire French media on this is starting now to question his judgment. I won't pretend that I've read all of them, but I understand that there's been criticism of him recently in Le Point and Figaro and newspapers like that. I'm not sure that this criticism is all connected with this plan he has, apparently, to send French troops to Ukraine, but perhaps it is. There are plenty of other things going wrong in France as well. The French economy is again starting to trend downwards. President Macron's popularity appears to be sinking like a stone, and was already doing so before he started saying these things. And apparently there is great nervousness within the ruling party, and perhaps on the part of President Macron himself, about the likely outcome of the European Parliament elections, which I believe are due to happen in May. There are suggestions that there will be a wipeout, that Le Pen's party will win, and win big. And by the way, if that happens, that will result in a solid group of French MPs coming to the European Parliament who are opposed to the war. So, an astonishing speech, and one that President Macron is persisting in despite the immense unpopularity and criticism of it that there is in France. And one, by the way, which appears to be putting President Macron's already difficult relations with Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Germany under further stress. Chancellor Scholz, and here undoubtedly he speaks for the great bulk of German opinion, is very supportive of Ukraine, willing to send Ukraine lots of weapons. But for the moment, at least, he is ruling out any deployment of German troops in Ukraine to fight Russia, something which, for obvious, understandable reasons, most Germans don't want to entertain. So why is Macron doing this? Why is he behaving in this way? Well, I think there are multiple reasons. One is the fact that President Macron feels very angry with President Putin. He made a big effort at the outset of his presidency to persuade President Putin to basically make up with Europe and subordinate himself to the policies of the EU. I still remember Putin's visit to France just after Macron became president, and the incredibly patronizing way in which Macron treated Putin, lecturing Putin on the policies of Peter the Great, the westernizing policies of Peter the Great, and trying to urge on Putin's own adoption of what Macron mistakenly believed were Peter the Great's ideas and policies. Anyway, so I think he's angry with Putin because Putin has not done the things that he expected. It seems that it was Macron who, prior to the start of the war, prior to the breakdown of relations, was trying to get the Russians to drop the Minsk agreement and to negotiate directly with the Ukrainians, something which at that time the Russians were making it absolutely clear that they would not do, because it would in effect mean an abandonment of the Minsk agreement by Russia, which was unacceptable to the Russians at that time. I can remember the furious démarche that the Russian Foreign Ministry published about that, and I have to say, astonished when I discovered that it was President Macron who had come up with this ill-conceived plan, which undoubtedly contributed to the growing distrust in Russia of the Europeans, and which played a role in leading us to the conflict that we are in now. So I think there is personal anger and bitterness on the part of Macron towards Putin, because Putin proved completely resistant to Macron's urgings and insinuations and attempts to win him round. I think that also there's probably a degree of petulance. We've seen how France's attempts to shore up its positions in West Africa over the last year have been unsuccessful. The coup in Niger has consolidated. Niger has now increasingly shifted into good relations with Russia. Other West African states appear to be moving in the same direction. By the way, talking about West African states, I understand that Nigeria is now the latest country to say that it wants to join the BRICS. This despite the fact that it's been a firm Western and American ally in recent years. Apparently that's changing. Anyway, Macron angry about what has happened in West Africa. Macron undoubtedly furious about the fact that the Russians retaliated against that French team that was based in that hotel in Kharkiv, French mercenaries or volunteers, as the French government insists they were, French soldiers masquerading as volunteers, as the Russians say they actually were. So there's all that too. But I suspect also that there are some deeper factors at play. Firstly, there is the sense of Macron's own grandiosity. His popularity is falling. His plans to build a new, stronger Europe with France leading it have, to all intents and purposes, turned to dust over the period of his presidency. His plans to reform and re-energize the French economy have turned to dust also. He sees his popularity fall. He senses that when he leaves the presidency, he will leave it as a failed president. And of course, his vanity makes that something he finds very difficult to accept. And of course, if his successor really is Marine Le Pen, well, he will regard that as a greater failure still. So there is that. There is the desire, therefore, to make up for the domestic failures and the anger towards Putin specifically by greater grandiosity, by posing as the strongest, most dynamic, Napoleonic figure in Europe. And, well, that partly explains it. But I can't help but think that ultimately the major reason why the French, or rather to be more precise, why Macron is talking in this way is because growing alarm in Europe, across Europe, which has been building now for several weeks, especially since Avdiivka fell, that the United States is losing interest in the perpetuation of Project Ukraine. We've seen now increasing number of clues that this is so. We had that article in the New York Times talking about, disclosing about the American intelligence bases in Ukraine. Recently on the Duran, we were privileged to interview Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Schaffer. He commented about this article. He has joined the various other intelligence officials who have spoken about this, former American intelligence officials who have spoken about this, and he has said that, in his opinion also, the publication of an article like this is a clear sign that a withdrawal from Ukraine by the United States, a pullback of some kind by the United States from Ukraine is starting, that Americans, the American leadership, the permanent state, can see that this project is ending as a debacle. There's a limit to how far they want to become drawn into what threatens to become a quagmire. And so they've decided quietly that the time has come to start pulling out. So that article in the New York Times points in that direction. The resignation of Victoria Nuland points in that direction also. Even more so, still more so, the backgrounds of the people who have replaced her. Kurt Campbell as Deputy Secretary of State, somebody who wants to prioritize on Asia and China. John Bass, who oversaw the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. General Brown at the Department of Defense. He doesn't seem to be too keen on the Ukrainian conflict either. He's shown none of the enthusiasm for it that we saw from General Milley, his predecessor. And now we've had this speech from the President of the United States, the State of the Union address, which talks about Ukraine in relatively short terms and tries to use the issue of Ukraine principally to attack the president's domestic supporters. So there is this feeling across Europe that the war in Ukraine is being lost, that Ukrainians might not be able to withstand further Russian pressure beyond the summer, that there might be a collapse in Ukraine beyond the summer. All that massive investment in money, the sacrifice of economies, the plundering of European militaries, that massive investment in political credibility is at risk of coming to nothing. And Macron is one of those people who can't accept this. It hurts his vanity too much. Well, we will have to wait and see what comes of all of this. The Kremlin, as I discussed yesterday, is warning the Europeans that they're playing with fire, and that was clearly principally directed at Macron himself. I have no doubt that if European troops were to enter Ukraine, they would become targets for the Russian military. So this is an extremely dangerous, petulant game that Macron is playing. He doesn't seem prepared to back off from it. However, he's now talking about sending French troops to Moldova, which is in the grip of a political crisis itself, one I will discuss shortly in another program. I think that this could trigger more problems for him in France. I doubt that it will come to very much in the end. I think the French military will be solidly opposed to these plans. And I also have to say, though, that it shows how desperate and panicky European leaders have become. I'm going to finish this video today with a quotation from an editorial in the Daily Telegraph. Now, yesterday, or rather the day before yesterday, in Britain, the British government, the Finance Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, announced the government's budget. And it was striking that despite all of the belligerence we've had from Britain towards Russia over Ukraine, all the blood-curdling talk about the threat from Russia to Britain and to Europe, the British government did not announce any increase in defence spending. They prioritised cutting taxes, even as they apparently are preparing for major cuts in spending overall. And there was this rather sad editorial in response to the Daily Telegraph, which has been a major advocate of support for Project Ukraine and for Britain's commitment to it, and which has been campaigning vehemently recently for an increase in defence spending. And the Daily Telegraph makes the point that British defence spending remains static. The same basically is true of Europe as well. Only Poland and Germany seem to be increasing defence spending at all. And in Germany, that's not achieving very much because most of the increases in defence spending in Germany are being siphoned into support for Ukraine. And this editorial contains this paragraph. The funding for defence, not just here, but in France and elsewhere on the continent, does not match the urgency of the political warnings about the threat posed by Russia. Either those warnings are being exaggerated or we are underprepared. Well, which do we think it is? Are the warnings being exaggerated, or are we underprepared? Well, I would say without any doubt that they are being exaggerated. But as the Daily Telegraph is saying, deep down, despite all of this talk about the threat from Russia, despite all the talk about the need to increase European preparedness, the Europeans are not increasing spending on defence, and that has to be because they don't themselves really believe that the threat from Russia that they're constantly talking about exists. All of this talk from Macron himself reflects not a threat from Russia to Europe, but rather a threat to the political positions, the credibility of the European leaders who led Europe down this blind alley of Project Ukraine. Well, that's the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check our shop, which, with all the amazing things that you will find there, our new line of sports clothes. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.